Our brains are these incredible engines for making sense of the world. They're constantly hunting for order in the chaos. But what if that powerful ability to find patterns is both the source of our greatest genius and our biggest mistakes? Today, we're diving deep into the paradox of the patterned mind. Of course you have. We all do it. You look up, and that puff of white isn't just a cloud anymore. Suddenly it's a dog, or a ship, or maybe a face staring right back at you. That's not just your imagination running wild. It's a fundamental feature of your brain's operating system. And here's the kicker. That exact same instinct, the one that connects the dots in the sky, can lead a scientist to a Nobel Prize-winning breakthrough, or it can lead someone down a rabbit hole, seeing a grand conspiracy and a series of random coincidences. This is the central paradox we're going to unpack today, how our brain's greatest strength can also be its most dangerous flaw. So here's our roadmap. First, we'll put a name to this glitch, Apophenia. Then we'll travel back in time to ask, why did we even evolve this way? We'll see how it fuels everything from conspiracy theories to stock market bubbles today. We'll look at the brain chemistry that's pulling the strings, walk that razor's edge between genius and madness, and finally, we'll talk about the most powerful tool we've ever built to tell the real patterns from the ghosts.
All right, so let's get formal. What is the actual name for this ghost in our cognitive machine? It's called apophonia, the tendency to see meaningful patterns in what is essentially random noise.
Now, you might think this term just came from studying everyday quirks, but its origin is actually much more clinical. Apophenia was first coined to describe the early stages of psychosis, and the key part of the definition is that specific feeling of abnormal meaningfulness. For these patients, it wasn't just guessing at connections. They felt them with this overwhelming, deeply personal significance. A random event wasn't a coincidence. It was a sign, a message meant just for them.
Apophenia is really the big umbrella term for a whole family of cognitive biases. Its most famous cousin is pareidolia. That's the one we started with, seeing faces in clouds. But then you've got confirmation bias, which is what happens after apophenia sparks an idea. You start looking for evidence that proves you're right. You've also got its statistical cousins, like the clustering illusion, that's the hot hand in basketball, and the gambler's fallacy, where you think a roulette wheel somehow remembers it landed on red 5 times and is due for black.
Okay, so if this tendency can lead us so far off track, why in the world do we even have it? Well, the answer lies deep in our evolutionary past. It turns out apophenia isn't a bug in our mental software. It was once a critical, life-saving feature. Just imagine you're an early human out on the savannah. You hear a rustle in the tall grass. You've got 2 choices. You can assume it's a predator. If you're wrong, and it's just the wind, what's the cost? A little wasted energy. That's a type 1 error, a false positive. Or you can assume it's just the wind. But what if you're wrong that time, and it's actually a predator? The cost is, well, your lunch. That's a type 2 error, a false negative. The cost of those 2 mistakes is just wildly asymmetrical. So evolution didn't really care about perfect accuracy. It cared about survival. It naturally selected for brains that were hypersensitive to patterns. It was always, always better to see a predator that wasn't there than to miss the one that was. Apophenia is the echo of that ancient survival logic. It's the cognitive price we pay for being the descendants of the paranoid, not the complacent.
The thing is, that ancient software is still running on our modern hardware, but our environment has changed a lot. So in a world without saber-toothed cats, where do these illusory patterns pop up today?
Oh, everywhere. We see it in superstitions, where an athlete is convinced their lucky socks help them win. We see it in financial markets, where traders spot trends in what are often just random noise. It's the engine of conspiracy theories, weaving totally unrelated events into one big secret narrative. And for those of you in STEM, it is a constant hazard in big data. With enough variables, you're almost guaranteed to find spurious correlations, like a link between ice cream sales and shark attacks. They're correlated, sure, but only because a third thing, summer, is causing both. And in a scientific or statistical context, this has a formal name that every single one of you knows, a type 1 error. It's when you falsely reject the null hypothesis. That's the default assumption that there's no pattern in the data. You claim you found a signal in the noise when really it was just a ghost. It's scientific apophenia. So we know what this is and why we have it, but what's actually going on inside our heads when we experience that jolt of abnormal meaningfulness? Well, the answer lies with a very famous neurotransmitter. We all hear about dopamine as the pleasure chemical, right? But that's a huge oversimplification. Its more fundamental job is to assign salience. Think of it like your brain's highlighter pen. When your dopamine system fires, it's basically screaming, pay attention to this. This is important. It flags things in your environment as being significant and worth focusing on. This leads us to something called the Aberrant Salience Hypothesis of psychosis. It's basically a three-step process. First, for whatever reason, the dopamine system becomes hyperactive and starts to misfire. Second, because of this, totally random, neutral events like a stranger's glance or a license plate number get tagged with intense, undeserved importance. All of a sudden, the mundane feels profound. And third, your conscious, rational mind scrambles to explain this bizarre feeling. It creates a story, a delusion, to make sense of the bottom-up neurochemical error. The story is just an attempt to rationalize the feeling.
And this, right here, is where things get really fascinating. Because that ability to see novel connections between things that seem totally unrelated, well, that's not just a feature of delusion. It's also the very definition of creativity.
In psychology, one mode of creative thought is called divergent thinking. This is your brainstorming mode, generating tons of new, weird, and varied ideas by making loose, unconventional connections. Sound familiar? It's functionally very, very similar to apophenia. It is the raw, unrefined material of creativity. But raw material isn't enough, right? You also need the second mode, convergent thinking. This is your internal editor. It's the logical, analytical process that takes all those wild ideas, tests them against reality, and selects the one that's actually useful and correct. And that's the difference. A delusion is pure, unchecked, divergent thinking, a fire hose of connections with no filter. But genius is what happens when you have both. It's a mind that can make those wild, apophenic-like connections, but it also has the powerful, intellectual rigor to filter, test, and refine them. It's not just apophenia, it's harnessed apophenia. So if our individual minds are so prone to making these errors, how can we ever trust that we're seeing a real pattern and not just a ghost in our own machine? Well, we do it by building an external filter. The scientific method, at its core, is basically a set of rules designed to protect us from our own apophenia. Falsifiability says your idea has to make a risky, testable prediction. Replicability demands that a pattern can't just be real for you, it has to show up for any independent researcher who looks for it. And like we talked about, the null hypothesis forces us to start from a place of skepticism. We have to prove a pattern exists against the assumption that it's just random noise. Ultimately, you can't just eliminate your brain's tendency to see patterns. It is wired way too deep into our evolutionary hardware. But we can build systems to manage it. Science isn't about having a perfect, unbiased brain. It's about using a set of tools and a community of critical thinkers to collectively reality test our own flawed perceptions. So recognizing our brain's love for illusory patterns isn't a weakness. It's the first and most crucial step towards actually understanding reality. The real question isn't whether you see patterns, it's what tools you use to tell the truth from the noise.